Hello and welcome to Head to Head. This is Vivica Williams, and today we're talking with Paul Niland, a political commentator based here in Kyiv. We'll be talking about two cities and understanding what's going on with the war in the East by understanding the histories of these two cities. Thank you so much for being with us today, Paul.
Thanks again for inviting me to the show.
So I was recently reading an article you read, and I had a lot of questions about this. And you were saying to understand the history of what's going on in the East, we need to understand the history of these two cities, Sloviansk and Kharkiv. Why these particular cities?
I think the most important thing about these two cities is that in general they're at peace today, and there were significant events in both of those cities in the early days of the creation of this conflict, and if you examine what happened there, if you look at Sloviansk was the epicenter of the war. That was the first city that was taken over. That was the stronghold of the group that was led by Russian citizen Igor Girkin, or Strelkov as his nom de guerre was, and that was his base. And Sloviansk is today, it was liberated by the Ukrainian army in June of 2014. And
when was it taken over? So let's kind of paint a picture. When was this?
So if the city was occupied for 4 months, then I would say April, May, June. It was taken over sometime in March. So again, within a very short period after the success of the anti-corruption and pro-democracy revolution that happened mainly in Kiev, not only in Kiev. And
also Crimea, so this whole period going on where we had the annexation of Crimea.
Exactly. And I think if you bring Crimea into the picture, it was very important for Russia because the narrative that had been played out on Russian internal TV and the external channels that they have like RT and the media that they use like Sputnik, was they were talking about, they were rubbishing the revolution as it was ongoing. They were talking about extremists and things that were just made up. But then after the success of the revolution, when Yanukovych fled, they needed to change the narrative, and the first thing that happened was Crimea, which you mentioned. But then the war in eastern Ukraine, and the reason why I wrote that article and why I'm pleased for the invitation to come in today and talk to you about this is because if you want to look at the war today, then we see what's happening, and every day there are Ukrainian and Russian. There's somebody's sons as well, right? Somebody's fathers, probably. There are people on both sides that are dying every day, and it's not enough just to simply look at the conflict as it stands and talk about the facts of the matter today and what's happening on the ground today. If you want to begin to resolve this conflict, the first thing that you have to do is you have to be clear about the origins of the conflict. And so this is why I wrote about Sloviansk, and this is why I wrote about Kharkiv. And Sloviansk, as we said, at one point, it was the epicenter of the war. That was where it was happening.
So it first started, how far away is Sloviansk from Donetsk, and how we see this movement coming across?
That's a very interesting question. And if you take a look at a map of eastern Ukraine, you'll see that Sloviansk is basically equidistant north of Donetsk and the same kind of distance from the city of Lugansk as well. And it's just a little bit further from Sloviansk. So if you imagine Sloviansk then is to the south of Kharkiv. And so the reason why that was the first place that was chosen for the beginning of the military operation was because of its strategic location in the middle of those three key cities. And that's brought Kharkiv into the picture now as well. During the months or the weekends, in the month of April, March and April, there were street battles on the streets in Kharkiv, and I love Kharkiv. It's a fantastic city. It's a place that I've been to a few times, and in fact, I've been to Sloviansk as well. I've travelled around huge numbers of cities in eastern Ukraine. I did a lot of work out there trying to help some investors, in actual fact, work with a local retail chain who were looking to expand out into all these cities that had populations of 100,000. So I've been all around there, and that's why for me it's it's kind of personal. But Kharkiv I'd known for some years, and I was watching while the world is reacting to the military land grab that was Crimea, I'm watching things unfold in Kharkiv as well, and seeing street battles and thinking this is wrong. It's strange, but the telling factor there was that it was only on weekends.
Which in Kharkiv?
In Kharkiv, the street fighting in Kharkiv. Monday through Friday, Kharkiv was a normal place, and people went about their business, whether they're studying, it's a big university town, whether they're studying or going to work or just, their normal family lives. And then the weekends, it all flared up.
And what about in Sloviansk? Let's go back to Sloviansk. What was going on in there in that time period?
The outbreak of conflict in Sloviansk came a little after the street fighting that we saw in Kharkiv. But again, my information about what was going on, or my perspective about what was going on in Sloviansk, comes from various different sources. And one thing is that I've been there, and so to me it was personal. But another thing is that the parents of friends of mine actually lived in Sloviansk. And so I was getting calls from my friend saying, what on earth is happening? Can you try and explain this to me? And he was relating to me what his parents were saying to him. And I volunteered to drive to the last Ukrainian checkpoint. If they could get out of the city, then I would pick them up and I would bring them back to Kiev. But he was telling me, and so, the offer was communicated to them, and then it came back, and they refused, because what the people of Sloviansk were being told at the time was, if you leave, then the apartment that you live in and everything that you own will be ransacked and stolen. And this is a couple, both intelligent, educated. One was actually a professor at a university. This is an older couple who have, throughout their lives, they've built up their possessions all around them, and the threat that everything will be taken away from you. You would leave with what you could get into a suitcase. Well, that's how the people of Sloviansk were actually held hostage by the people who came to their town. And interestingly, I went as well to a shelter in Kiev for internally displaced people, and met people from Sloviansk, and I was talking to them as well about what was going on. And the phrase that they used, the word that they used to describe the people who were behind the outbreak of hostilities was banditi, bandits. Right. That's how locals from Sloviansk were talking about the people who came to create war in their city. But now what you see, and again, this is why I wrote it, and this is why it's great that we're talking about this today. Now what you see is a peaceful city.
And so what was the change? Why did you write that understanding Sloviansk, the history of what happened with the city is critical today? What was it that happened? What was the process there that brought this?
The catalyst actually for writing the article was a good friend of mine who's a Canadian guy who's done a lot of work with the training of the patrol police here. He introduced me to an American defense contractor who was trying to get an understanding of what was happening here in Ukraine, trying to understand the war. And so the basis for the article was actually an email that I wrote back to this lady saying, okay, if you want to understand the conflict, here was the origin, here was the beginning of it. But also as well, Sloviansk has a great, I said last time I was in this studio, I tweet far too much, but one of my favorite Twitter accounts is at Sloviansk. And it's people in that city who, on a daily basis, they're tweeting photographs about life in Sloviansk, about parks being cleared up, about children's recreation facilities that are being painted, about the beautiful city and the lakes and things that are on the outskirts of that city. And every day it's a daily reminder that this is a city now at peace. And I believe that the rest of Ukraine can actually emulate that as well. And if we look at how quickly after the foreign presence left the city of Sloviansk, if we look at how quickly Sloviansk returned to normal, that is the best example of how I think the rest of Ukraine will return to normal at the end of the conflict. But as I said at the outset, if we want to understand the conflict today, we have to understand where it came from. And I was in a meeting, a discussion on Sunday evening with some people, and the conclusion that we came to is the conflict will only end the day that Russia stops putting men, munitions, equipment across the border, which is open. The day that Russia decides to do that, the conflict is over. And And until Russia decides to do that, the conflict will continue.
And so with the story behind and the idea behind Sloviansk is showing how quickly you think that the East could return back to a sort of normalcy, back to a peacefulness once this war is ended.
I think that it demonstrates that that is absolutely possible. How quickly Sloviansk returned to a normal way of life, we have to bear in mind that that was only occupied for 4 months.
Right.
Well, I say only. The people that were in Sloviansk for those 4 months, there's no only. That was a torturous time in the history of their city. The cities of Donetsk and Lugansk have now been occupied for 3 years. And when we say occupied, we're not just talking about the people that are holding the locals there essentially to hostage, the same way as the people of Sloviansk were hostages. The people essentially have no choice in this. There are men with guns, and they are dictating what's going on, and that's it. But as well as the fact that the people who hold power there now do so by virtue of the fact that they're holding guns and by virtue of the fact that they were installed by the Kremlin, they've also conducted an operation to affect the ways of thinking, to affect the minds of people. We know that, in Russia, it's an essential part of the continuation of the Vladimir Putin regime that they control the airwaves, that they control the way that people think there. And they've done the same in the statelets that they've tried to create in eastern Ukraine as well. Right. One of the very first things that they did, in fact, if you look at the kind of infrastructure that was seized in the early days of the conflict, day one, job one, take those TV towers.
Well, absolutely. This is historic with propaganda, with changing what people see, what they can hear, where they get their information from. So this is historic. So you saw this initially with Sloviansk when this was starting over, with this changing the narrative of things that people could hear. And so what was the period like when we went from the occupation from 4 months, and how quickly was the city liberated?
It took significant time for the city to be liberated, but what actually happened in the end was there'd been an ongoing battle for several weeks. And one day, the forces that were there had simply withdrawn from Sloviansk and headed 80 kilometers south to Donetsk, and Sloviansk had been the forward operating base. The assumption was that that would be the point from which they then spread out further, but they had to then retreat to Donetsk, and Donetsk at that point became a city at war. It hadn't been prior to that. But what was very, very interesting as well, we talk about the return to normality, and I mentioned the patrol police earlier on. So Sloviansk now has a new patrol police force that works in that city. And I was talking with somebody last summer who had just returned from Sloviansk, and he told me that the people there, number one, they love the patrol police because they're efficient, reliable, polite, not corrupt, right? The new patrol police is one of the great successful reforms that Ukraine can talk about. But the other thing that he said as well is that as well as the locals loving the patrol police, they also told him that the crime rate had significantly gone down in Sloviansk as well, because when those the foreign forces retreated from Sloviansk, they also took with them what had been the criminal clan, the organized crime figures in the city of Sloviansk, because it's wrong to say that no locals participated in this war. Some locals did. But they were the kind of locals who participated. It was people who were involved in organized crime. And so as the forces withdrew from Sloviansk, the local bad guys left with them as well. That's who had joined up with them and was fighting alongside them, and that's who left with them as well. So Sloviansk, for many reasons, is a great example of and something that deserves study. It's a great example of how the conflict has unfolded and how it changes afterwards as well.
And so the takeaway from this then for our viewers and for maybe even government, what's the takeaway then for Sloviansk and for the importance of it?
The simple, most important thing is that Sloviansk is a peaceful part of Ukraine. And so whereas people were talking about it, or the media were talking about it as a rebel-held city, it wasn't. The term rebel denotes somebody who is uprising against their own government. Right. That's not what happened.
Right.
What happened in Sloviansk wasn't the agency or the energy or the effort of the local population of that city. It was done in spite of them. It was done to them, not by them. And the key takeaway is that today it's a peaceful city.
And so then what we could also take away from this, even though it's been 3 years of occupation in the further parts of the East, is that this is not a lost area. These aren't necessarily people who, as we say, want to not be part of Ukraine. So our takeaway there as well is that there needs to be some re-embracing of people and from areas when they do return to Ukrainian government forces.
I think you're exactly right. Certainly the areas that are currently occupied are not lost, far from it. I have many friends from that part of Ukraine, people who are Ukrainian patriots, people from Donetsk who have left their home, left their businesses, and come to Kiev with their families and rebuilt their lives, and they still care passionately and deeply not only about their country but about their fellow Donetsk natives, about their fellow Lugansk natives, and you know, many people that were there. There's an example of a professor in Lugansk who was recently sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, and he didn't leave. His surname's Kozlovsky. I think his first name was Ivan. A well-noted intellectual, a well-respected gentleman in Lugansk, who was just recently sent to prison. But he didn't leave because his son has disabilities, and you know, he wasn't able to just uproot his son's life. And there are lots of people like that who are stuck behind enemy lines, essentially,
right.
who deserve the respect of their countryfolk, and who deserve their government to be doing everything that they can to reunite the country.
Absolutely. And so this is, we do hear people say, just let this area go. There are people who say that. And the fact is that this is Ukraine. It's still part of Ukraine. There are people who believe that and who want to return to Ukraine. Let's talk about Kharkiv for a little bit. So this is the second city you mentioned in the article.
Yeah.
So what is it about Kharkiv that we need to understand?
Kharkiv was the second city mentioned in the article. It's also the second city in Ukraine. So Kharkiv is a city of 1.4 million people. It's a very, very large place. I was there in September of last year, on the main square in Kharkiv, which is an enormous place, it's one of the largest squares in all of Europe, in fact. On the main square in Kharkiv, there is a museum to the war. And around the square, there are memorials to citizens of Kharkiv who have gone either as volunteers or joined up with the National Guard or whatever, but have gone to war for their country. And Kharkiv is a city that's just 30 kilometers from the border with Russia. And so, as I wrote in the article, you know, if you look at a Russian-speaking city, which predominantly Russian-speaking, which you know has very close proximity to Russia, you would think that if there was anything to do with, you know, closeness to Russia or language issues that were at the root of this conflict, then you would think that Kharkiv would be gone as well. And there was a time when the authorities in Kharkiv, the early days after Yanukovych fled, where they did certainly appear to be flirting with separatism. But at some point the decision was made that Kharkiv was not going to fall. The people of Kharkiv actually stood up as well. When those street battles went on throughout those weekends, they were people who were bussed in who were the aggressors, by and large, 95% of them. But it was the local people, and I remember seeing footage of the time of predominantly younger people, you know, kids in their late teens and early 20s, who were standing up, and they literally fought for their future. Absolutely.
Kharkiv was a very big stronghold and unexpected. People didn't, as you said, people didn't really expect this much from Kharkiv. It was very adamantly pro-Ukraine and for staying in Ukraine.
Yes, and I said that Kharkiv is Ukraine's second city. There was a time actually when, in history, when Kharkiv was the capital of Ukraine, and because of that, it's always been very much an intellectual place, and there's also quite a lot of Ukrainian that's spoken there as well. Although the day-to-day language predominantly is Russian, but yeah, the people of Kharkiv they stood up when they needed to, and it was interesting as well. So another motivation, in fact, for writing the article that I wrote was my Facebook memories came up with something from 3 years ago. There was an image from the Kharkiv Observer from, I think it was the 11th of May, of a pro-Russian gathering next to the Lenin monument that used to stand on the square there. And when you look at that photograph, there were 200 or 300 people there. And when I shared that on Facebook 3 years ago, I wrote, these people are absolutely within their democratic rights to stand there and peacefully talk about their pro-Russian position. But the number of people that were gathered there really demonstrates what the actual element size of pro-Russian feeling would be in a city of 1.4 million people. There were 200 or 300 people who were standing on the square.
Wow. Well, and this is definitely a great takeaway, that Kharkiv remains today pro-Ukrainian and in Ukraine. And despite what Russia would say about language, about needing to protect people of language, there's no question about that. Paul, I really wish we had more time to go on because this could be a very fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'll come back.
Absolutely. Thank you. Today we've been speaking to Paul Niland, a political commentator. Thank you for joining. This has been Vivica Williams.